Welcome. We are joined today by Simon Dixon. Assalamu alaikum, Simon. Thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam. I'm really looking forward to this.
So, Simon is one of our headline speakers at the Muslim Bitcoin Summit in London in October, where we are bringing together builders, scholars, Islamic finance experts, and people like Simon who have been in this space for a long time and who many people may not even know is Muslim and therefore will have a particularly valuable set of views for other Muslims on the topic. All to discuss Bitcoin as a tool for sovereignty, as a tool for financial freedom, and an opportunity to reshape the future. So again, thank you, Simon, for joining us. Simon, I will let you introduce yourself in full, but Simon is somewhat of a legend to many of us in the Bitcoin space, has been around for a long time, has been involved in the very early days of Bitcoin in some of the early stage companies that were around building the infrastructure in those early days, and has done a great job as well of breaking down complex topics for us all around the financial industry, the military industry, the technology industry, the systems of control in the world that we live in. And you'll do a much better job of explaining it than I will, but I will hand over to you, Simon, to give a full intro.
Yeah, so I guess I'll share with, in Sufi literature and Quranic literature, there's this concept that really caught me from an economic perspective. So, my journey is I've been involved in nothing but finance and money for 26 years. And there's this concept in economics of an invisible hand. And that was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But what's really interesting is prior to the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's literature was around morality and sociology as well. And so even though the invisible hand only got 4 mentions, in Quranic literature and the work of the scholars, the greats like Al-Ghazali or, Ibn Khaldun, that really predated by hundreds of years a lot of this literature, there wasn't an invisible hand, there was an open hand. And an open hand kind of is this concept that once I understood it really stuck with me, that we have free will, but there is an open hand, and our decisions, and particularly for me, from my subject of expertise, monetarily, economically, and financially, that while we're taught that money is neutral as a tool, it can actually be constructed in ways that are either haram by nature, in terms of, is there riba built into that money in its construction? Now, we can, with an open hand and with free will, I think there's a concept of us being able to cleanse money in a neutral instrument by how we use it and what we do with it. But wouldn't it be great if, like the scholars, kind of arrived at gold because of the nature of gold? Now, if we have a digital nature of gold built into a protocol, then I think that's something we're all going to explore at this conference. And it's a very interesting, open question. I have very strong opinions about it, but I think that because I've been involved in Bitcoin right from the beginning, when it was a few people in a room, I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in Prague in Europe. And I wrote the first published book 15 years ago that included Bitcoin. I have an opinion about its origins. I have an opinion about, many of the accusations that people make around it. And I know there's a lot of misinformation. So maybe one of the things we could do together with an open hand is help people understand the truth. Because as a Muslim, even when it's inconvenient, we have to commit to the truth. Even if it's against our own interest, we have to tell truth. It's a fundamental principle that we have to struggle with and adhere to. And so if we can move this closer to the truth, but that's, a little bit upon some of the things I think we can achieve together. But going back to how did I end up in this situation? Well, 26 years ago, my father lost all of his money in the stock market. He built it up his whole life. And he was inherently, my father was, I wouldn't call him religious, but He was brought up around the Church of England, and it was his culture. My mother, actually, I wasn't brought up by my mother. I knew her from up till I was about 8 years old, but she was ethnically Jewish. I wouldn't call her religious either, from what I knew of her. They're both passed away now. But I had those cultures around me, and kind of when you're young, I see a child it's kind of like an operating system. We're born with a fitra, a soul, a good soul. And over time, we have these nafs, these egos that kind of take us in a direction. But another thing happens with our parents and our environment. We're kind of installed a technology into our brain, like an operating system. I think of it like that. Most people's beliefs are operating systems that were installed into them. They downloaded it, and then it became their belief. And so I was meant to be a Christian, or I was meant to be a Jew, and everything around me was kind of pushing me in that direction, by school, by everything, by culture, by things. But one of the things I encourage people to do, and what actually we are encouraged to do as a Muslim, is study, commit to knowledge. And, so I always committed to that knowledge. But one of the things that drove me in my life is that my father lost all of his money. And so he went from wealthy, he was kind of in the gambling scene, so he made it through gambling. And that translated into putting it all in the stock market and then getting taken out by the dot-com boom and bust. Now, I was 19 years old, and my father asked me what happened to my money. And for 26 years, I committed to answering that question. Has kind of driven me with an open hand. And in that journey, I wrote several books, and one of them was studying Islamic finance. And really, I wanted to understand Islamic finance from first principles.
This
And
is
so
not so well known that you wrote a book about Islamic finance. It's interesting. When did you write this book?
It wasn't a book about Islamic finance. It was a book called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. It was the first published book that included Bitcoin, and it had a little bit of it on Islamic finance. It definitely wasn't a full book on Islamic finance. But that was the beginning of my journey, because everything in my life, I worked in banking, I worked in investment banking. I tried to create a bank because I discovered this baseline problem with money in answering my father's question, that it was always the structure of money, that inherently riba, interest, is built into the construct of how money and fiat currency is created. And that has a big knock-on effect, because imagine, you go to borrow some money. There is no money in the economy if you don't borrow it. That's the first thing to figure out. Every bit of money, every digital money that exists in the world, apart from the physical cash, which is a tiny percentage, is created by somebody else borrowing it into existence. So when you go to a bank and you borrow it, they don't have the money. That's not grandma's savings. That's not somebody else's savings. They actually write it into existence. And they then say, but you've got to repay it plus interest. So the question is if all money is written into existence as debt, and there's interest to pay on top, where does the money come into existence to pay the interest? Well, the answer is you have to find someone else to go into debt, and then you have to create more interest, and then you have to find more individuals to go into debt. And when you run out of individuals, you find businesses to go into debt. And when you run out of businesses, you dump it on the government and you get the government to go into debt. Now, this has a massive knock-on effect, because the easiest way to get a government into debt is to wage a war on that government. And so now you have the construct of the world that we have today. You have military that is able to take countries into debt slavery. You have a financial system that profits from war and rebuild. And now you have technology that allows you to build digital control grids around this. And so my discovery that took me all this time to figure out is actually the process of money creation has so many side effects. And that kind of brings you into, well, how do you get out of that? How do you resist that? How do you cleanse that?
Would you say that thinking about money led you to thinking about Islam, or was it a parallel situation where you thought about these things and like what led you to being a Muslim?
Yes. So my first discovery was answer my father's question. Then I figured out the problem with interest. Then I wanted to write a book on that problem, which was Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. That led me to finding Bitcoin and Islamic finance. When I
Wow.
wanted to go deeper into that subject later, then I looked at Islamic finance and said, right, well, what do they know? Why is this being preserved? It's meant there's an element of that in Jewish theology. There's an element of that in Christian theology. Now, is Islamic finance really Islamic? I discovered that there's a whole problem around there as well, because it's built on the traditional system. But it's an attempt, an open hand, but can also be co-opted. But with that, I said, I don't want to study Islamic finance. I want to understand Islam. And so I read the Quran. And then when I read the Quran, I came to the conclusion that this can only be divine. And it explained to me in literature what didn't make sense to me from my Christian upbringing and my Jewish roots. But it gave me a story at the time that said that I left reading the Quran saying, that makes sense. Everything makes sense. And also, this is actually a book that doesn't have contradictions, that actually also is, to me, the best literature I've ever read on everything I've ever read for sustainable humankind. And so then I went through a bit of a process, a journey that I would go through, which I do with everything, which is I follow the money. I realized I started to look at, is this book preserved? Is it tainted? And then I came to my own conclusions from there and decided that if I follow these principles, then I believe that ultimately, there is an afterlife and we are going to be held accountable. And our life is about everything that I read in that scripture. I have a bit of an interesting relationship with, because when I look at religions, I always look at monetary incentive, political incentive. So I did study bits of the sectarian side, human literatures. And so I kind of really just focus on the Quranic side of that. And, but, I have a methodology, I guess, as the scholars had a methodology in determining what human scripture adds to that. But there's, so I focus less on I focus more on the Quranic side than the institutional side. And I study the scholars that help us get our understanding of the Quran better.
MashaAllah.
And did you find, so for you, was it a process of, were you already in Bitcoin at this time once you had gone down this path and realized that Islam had a prohibition still in place on the riba, for example, and this tied in very much with your understanding of interest being a problem inherent in the system? Were you already in Bitcoin at this point, or was Bitcoin something that then came to you after you had gone on this kind of voyage of discovery?
Yeah, so I was already in Bitcoin before reverting, and it was a journey. A thing that kind of, we guided it with an open hand. We're guided into parts. We study, and eventually you reach a conviction, and that's when I reverted. But if we look at the actual journey, so immediately after my father asked me to figure out what happened to his money, I studied economics. I did the traditional thing. And I realized, getting to masters in economics, they don't actually teach you the reality of money. And so you're taught what I consider indoctrinated operating system installed version that have an agenda version of economics. The Keynesian school of thought, which is the construct of the Bretton Woods system, today, and how you get a government into debt. You're taught classical economics, which is more like laissez-faire. You take the ethics, you replace an open hand with an invisible hand, which is saying the market is the god. And then you're taught, if you're lucky, Austrian economics, which touches upon hard money. And so as a like Milton Friedman type, you're justifying why inflation exists. as a Keynesian, you're justifying why governments print money. And as an Austrian, you're taught actually use gold because it's the only way to stop governments printing money. But you don't get the full answer because, you get the Adam Smith version after taking out the morality, which then if you study back in history, you realize, when the Islamic scholars were attributing the Greek philosophers and the Roman texts, there was a difference, right? They took those philosophical work, attributed it to the original source, and then combined it with their Quranic understanding of ethics and morality. And that led to much of the literature that later became economics. And then when Adam Smith wrote it, it was like, they deleted all the history and made it out like this was a European Renaissance or, something. And that they discovered all the literature. They kind of went from the Greeks to the Europeans and just took out the golden age of Islam when Europe happened to be in the dark ages. and so, when you discover these things, you realize I've got to relearn all history. Like everything I've been taught is a lie. And I found that when I was at university, I went to Manchester University, did a master's in economics, and then I read my side books. And I read a book that really helped me was called The Grip of Death by Michael Rowbotham. And it explained to me how the IMF works, how central banking works. And I was like, why aren't I taught that in university, And so then I got so I was like, okay, I haven't got the answer. So I decided, why don't I work in the machine? So I actually got a job at the stockbroker. It was a stockbroker in Manchester called TD Waterhouse. And that was the same stockbroker when my father lost all his money. And so I was like, I got a job as a T-boy. I worked my way up to stockbroker. I then learned how this is just selling stocks is a sales job, but who's on the other side of the trade? And then I learned there's these things called the market makers in the City of London. So I got a job as a market maker in the City of London. Then I realized I'm just the other side of that trade is retail, where my father lost all his money. And the other side of that trade is Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and the largest fund managers in the world. And I learned the manipulation that's involved in taking retail money and transferring it to what I call the financial industrial complex. And then finally, my last job was in investment banking. This is when I learned the war machine up front. I'll never forget, there was a pitch for a countrywide strategy. And this is when I was out at this point. I decided to leave. When you're pitching for rebuild contracts in countries and public offerings and various other things, you have to make a case of how regional stability is 100 times more profitable than war. And so if you want to end a war, you need to create a 100x return from peace. And then there is a model that I learned, which is you take the companies, you make them public, you securitize them, you financialize them, now you tokenize them. You build a derivative complex so you can manipulate the prices. You become the number one shareholder so you can install boards. Then you get the voting rights. And there is a whole construct around the profit from war and then the rebuild afterwards. And then actually, sometimes the model is, like in Afghanistan, for example, the model was, don't solve the war because we can print money for 20 years. We can replace a version of the Taliban that was resisting against drugs and replace it with a version of the Taliban that's supporting the Western drug trade. And you put 20 years in between and you can dump a load of debt on the American people. That's $2 trillion of profit there. And it goes back into the stock market. And then you get the rebuild contracts afterwards. So there's different models. There's destroy a country in order to take its resources quickly. There's the forever war, which is don't win the war, just keep the war going. And then there's the end of the war where you move to rebuild contracts and you profit from peace. And that's kind of the investment banking model. But I was one little corner of that. And so it was then when I decided to leave. And that's when I wrote this book and I got involved in banking reform. This was when I discovered I now discovered the corrupt education system. Didn't answer my father's question. I then discovered the corrupt financial system. I then left and I started working on banking reform. Then I realized we had the global financial crisis at this point. What did I discover? That the people that were fixing the system were the same people that created the problem. And so the reform is sponsored by lobbies and non-governmental organizations and policies and think tanks, and the politicians are paid for by lobbies. So you realize the political system is captured as well. And so who were the beneficiaries of the financial crisis? The same people that created it. And so then I decided, well, what can I do? Can I create a bank? So my wife and myself, we incorporated a company called Bank to the Future. We applied for a license at the Bank of England. And what we wanted to do is have a bank that was built off Islamic principles. That's when I wrote that book and started to understand it. We wanted to be a custodian of money. We didn't want to create deposits every time we issued a loan. We were looking at collateralized loans based with interest-free collateralized loans based upon a custody fee. And we applied to the Bank of England, and they said, this is what they said. Firstly, there's only 4 banks that got a license. Go find someone to go on your board that's already got a license. So there was a 5th bank that got a license. We got that person on our board. So what they try and do is they try and change the culture to a bank culture. So first thing we did, we got someone that had on our board. Then what happened is they said, right, to apply the license, you need to deposit 60 million at the Bank of England to get an account. I was like, I don't have 60 million. So they then bankrupted us. We went broke trying to make this work, Then they said, right, you deposit the 60 million, you get a board that's got experience in banking, and then you need to build your bank on top of one of these 4 banks. So you're saying to me, and this is my problem with Islamic finance, you realize that you're building on top of a system that's inherently flawed. And so you're trying to cleanse it. But what they said is all your deposits, you get to be a custodian, but you have to deposit them at Barclays Bank or another bank. And then they get to use that as collateral to build fractional reserve banking. So what we realize is it's not possible to do full reserve banking or Islamic banking within the system connected to a central bank. And at that stage, this is when we were completely broke. We were in debt trying to make this work. And someone contacted me that was part of the banking reform stage. Sorry to go so long, but it helps understand. And this is my entry into Bitcoin. So a guy called Johnny Bitcoin attended one of my presentations that I was giving. And he said, I've sold my house and I've moved into a squat in Old Street in London. And I'm here with some developers that are working on Bitcoin. Do you want to find out a bit more about it? That was my first introduction. I met a guy called Amir Taki, who was one of the early Bitcoin developers, a strange character, to say the least. But he was one of the early, and he was contributing to this open source project. And he was running a conference in Prague, and he invited me to that conference. There was probably about 50 people that went to that conference. Bitcoin just started trading at $30. It crashed to $3. We had a 90% crash. And this is when I got my first Bitcoin and then started investing in the companies as we generated returns that would build the industry, and watched all those companies one by one get captured into the system. And so it kind of brought me to where we are today after this 15-year journey, invested in 100 different companies in the industry. Obviously, Bitcoin treated us very well, so the financial pressure was relieved, and had the time to just go through this journey and think about, is there an application between, money, how it's created, and the spiritual element, the sovereign elements, and some of my ideological beliefs. And And my answer is yes, absolutely. So that brings us where we are today.
Yes, it's a great journey. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's actually really interesting to hear the background, the kind of more the deeper background and the family roots to a lot of your origin story, let's call it, and your journey to Islam. And it sounds like you have arrived at a place where many of us have ended up, and that's of course why we have a group that is putting together this summit in October. Is that there is this genuine belief that the principles upon which our religion is based, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and all of this, there is a large element of uh, fairness and justness in trade and commerce and economic activity that very much relies on having a sound monetary standard, right? And the more time you spend with this and you ponder on it, the more the two systems, the more the two areas of thinking converge. But I think there's probably also some differences as well. For example, many Bitcoiners I'm sure you would have met along your way, and especially when I was learning about it, it's a very much a libertarian leaning way of thinking. And I'm interested to understand, because it's a very attractive school of thought, especially when you're living in a system that is, on foundations of debt and inflationary money, to believe that these problems could be simply fixed through just self-interest, essentially, and economic actors acting in self-interest. I would be interested to understand from your perspective, did your views there kind of differ from the traditional Bitcoiner libertarian leaning view on things because you had this spiritual element involved?
I think so. So, firstly, we normally, as me, we were indoctrinated, and I was no different, into, we know what happened when my father lost all his money. After that, we had 9/11, right? And so I was indoctrinated into the stereotypical belief around terrorism and, all this stuff. And so I had to learn about many of these covert operations and then social engineering and truth. And so one of my things when I first read the Quran is trying to figure out, well, how come all these things that aren't in the Quran, people say. And then you realize that there's a lot more literature and various other things, and you go through this journey. But one of the really important things for me that I learned from the Quran that was aligned with me is, Allah tells us to question everything, to study. We are on this earth to be knowledge people. And so, that is very different to my upbringing as a Christian and my mother's ethnic Jewish roots. Because there is very much, this is the truth, this is the culture, but don't study, the history of the literature in terms of where it came from, the 1,000 years of change and stuff. So for me, I got my answer in the Quran around that. And so I think that's kind of that journey. But once you reach a place where you say, okay, there's something very, you then realize that ethics comes into play. And, we have a struggle, we have free will, and our struggle with our nafs, our ego, our morality, our right and wrong is an internal struggle, right? And so when I looked at the university side as well, I came to the conclusion that communism versus capitalism versus socialism versus libertarianism is nothing but a incomplete, false dichotomy that is weaponized in order to justify war. And so, armed with that understanding that in the post-Bretton Woods system that was set up from the transition to the British Empire and American Empire, that we entered immediately into a Cold War between quote-unquote communism and capitalism. But there was no capitalism in America because it was built upon a central banking system that inherently transfers wealth, creates wealth inequality, a K-shaped economy, and inherently is a Ponzi scheme where the interest doesn't exist. And then you look at the Soviet Union and communism in Russia, and you realize that, the Bolshevik Revolution was an engineered overthrow of the Russian Tsar. And then you go through the history and the Japan, China wars and everything, you realize that communism was a Western ideology from Karl Marx that funded militia groups and revolutions in order to install communism. And so the West created fake capitalism through central banking and communism, and then an ideology called libertarianism, where you're like, okay, the system's corrupt. What do I do? Well, we need to minimize the government, but that's not compatible with central banking, because central banking is a Ponzi scheme, and so therefore the government will always expand because you have to load the debt on the people, and you socialize the losses through the national debt. So the government always gets bigger until it's bankrupt. And so people call that capitalism. Well, no, that's not capitalism. So, right, we don't have communism and we don't have capitalism, and both of them were engineered through corrupt university systems, and then they're installed into our brain and it makes up our ideology. And maybe we reject the government, so we become a libertarian, and maybe we discover Austrian economics. But you always get back to the root of what are the key questions. And the key questions I came up with is, well, not I came up with, but literature came up with, and I agree with, is you end up with a concept of free trade is good. So as a Muslim, we believe in free trade. We believe in hard money. And so there's a vast literature of the corrupting element of debasement. And even the Islamic scholars came up with Gresham's law. Doesn't sound like Gresham, but Gresham law is the concept of, good money, hard money, crowding out soft money. That was reinvented into Gresham, as I said, through this process of co-opting Islamic literature. But, we always talked about hard money. So hard money is a concept that we believe in. So free trade and hard money. But what's missing? Well, most Austrian economists and libertarians believe in voluntarism, which ideologically I believe in, but I actually believe in accountability. So if we are accountable if we're not accountable to our creator, and we don't have, and I'm not talking about fake accountability. As a Muslim, we are not allowed to do performative accountability. We can't give to charity and tell people about it, because we're meant to give to charity and not tell people about it, right? The reason is because if you believe that you are accountable to somebody that doesn't know the performative you, the outward you, the person I say I am, not who I am, that's a major difference. So as a Muslim, we believe in inner accountability. Allah is ultimately always watching me, and my internal struggle, jihad, another word they weaponized, is my internal struggle, can be external as well, but my internal struggle with my ego, with my nafs, okay? So I can't pretend to be outer accountable. I'm ultimately on my own, and Allah sees that. So there's no performative element, but it's a struggle. That's the concept, right?
And I think also it's important to highlight that in libertarianism or the Austrian economy philosophy is the self-ownership, versus in Islam, we are not owning ourselves. God owns us and everything in the world. So this is like a main philosophical difference, which makes Austrian economy and libertarian philosophy not so compatible with Islam. But what do you think about this?
Beautiful. So philosophical, and this is why I read the Quran to understand Islamic finance, because if you don't understand the first principle dimension, you can't get to the right answer. And I'm not saying, I've got my best thinking of 26 years of study of what I think the answer is, but Allah knows best, and we're here to be knowledgeable people. But yes, if you have self-interested people optimizing their own utility without a level of accountability to a creator, then I argue that what is it that an individual is accountable to? Well, some may be religious, they may believe in the spirit, but others may be atheist, others may be spiritual and believe in something else. But ultimately, you're the judge of morality. And when you're the judge of morality, what determines morality? Well, your ego, your nafs. And so once you are accountable to your ego and you are maximizing for self-interest, you end up with a central banking system. Now you could end up believing in gold, and libertarians and Austrian economics believe in hard money and gold. But if there's no inner accountability and we are individuals self-maximizing, through an invisible hand where the market is God, then we end up with what happened to gold, where you create paper contracts against that gold. And then when it's inconvenient, you debase it and you use fiat currency. You come off the gold standard. Why? Because a self-maximizing central bank looking out for its own interest will always roll over the debt. And if it can capture politicians and nation states, then it will lobby to change law. And when faced with the market needs to correct, we've had bad behavior that led to this pump. Now we need to correct. Then you end up socializing the losses, privatizing the gains, and coming off the gold standard. So the problem with the gold standard was that it relied upon law when you integrate it into a monetary system. So how do you prevent that? To me, there's only one way. There's only one way, which is the individual needs to be accountable to a moral framework that is divine. And as long as that moral framework is correct, then this is why Ibn Khaldun said there's always cycles, because it's our internal struggle, but most people won't face that struggle. And so what happens across 4 generations? You end up with a rise of empire and a fall of empire. And that's based upon the removal, the incentives, because self-indulgence, voluntarism, if you have hard money and you have free trade and you don't have an ethical code in that, then you end up with the cyclical rise and fall of empires continually. Now, maybe that's the way Allah designed the world, that we need to learn the lessons continually. So right now we're at the end of that empire and we're getting record degeneracy, record gambling, record drug addiction, record homelessness, record degeneracy. And that's the end of cycle. In the British, that was culminated the European Empire in the Weimar Republic, and then you had an uprising, Hitler, that ended up committing those atrocities. Then that goes into the Palestine story and all that stuff, right? But that is just a reflection of this cycle. And that was the same time as the fall of the Ottoman Empire. What led to the end of the Ottoman Empire? 50 to 60, 80 years before the military operations, before the corruption that led to the British Empire takeover and occupying Palestine and all the Zionism and all that stuff, was a country that its leadership forgot its ethics and got deep in debt to Western financial powers and the Bank of England. And so there was a financial degradation, which led to a moral degradation, which led to the fall. And then we end up with the rise of the wars and the depressions and the changes. So this cyclical nature is built because for some reason you can't get the world to buy, for whatever reason, you can't get the world to buy into ethical accountability. So that's where I think it falls. And so free market, free trade, hard money, but you will always have a rise and fall unless you have ethical accountability. And personally, my ethical accountability is the divine rules of what I believe is in the Quran.
The more religion you have, the less state you need, and the more state you have, the less religion you end up with.
And that's why the weaponization of religion was combination of religion and state, right? So you separate religion and state, and then you have, these, the parts of the religion where, people confuse one's relationship with our creator with a country that's deciding that they're going to implement Sharia law and their interpretation of Sharia law, whether it be Sunniism or Shiaism or whatever. But it's when you have that combination, to me, it's the soul, the creator, and then you have country, company, belief, mind, things that get in the way, right? And I understand the desire to combine governance of a country with ethical principles. I don't think it's ever been done successfully, and it always gets co-opted. And so when you combine this, and this is the rise and fall, this is the cyclical nature. And maybe that's the lesson. The lesson is we are on earth to learn from that. It never, and it's how we react to that.
I liked your analogy to the operational system that's installed in us. And when you read the Quran, maybe you also notice that the operation system of the Quran is based on non-compulsion. There's no compulsion in religion. While the statist ideology that we learn in the school and university in the educational system is based on compulsion, coercion. Yeah, the statism is the monopoly over violence, and
yeah, completely agree. And again, like this eternal knowledge lesson, when you relearn history, the real history, you realize, of course, there was corruption in, whenever you combine state, conquest, and religion. We have our own history of, corruption that can happen there, but that's the leader's relationship with the creator. And we have, very clear guidance on how to deal with that. But if you look at the entire Islamic history, from the prophets right through to its expansion across the West Asia and Northern Africa, we are taught a version of history that is so inaccurate. Like it is so unbelievably, it's so obvious that history is always written from the perspective of the victor of the war. And so if you look at the relationship between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, this hostile relationship between Jews and Muslims is a modern creation. And it coincides with Zionism.
for sure.
Because historically, the Jews, because of the belief of religious tolerance and free will, in you determining, there's no compulsion in Islam, you have to reach that conclusion. The Jews and the Christians under Muslim leadership were always better off than the Jews in the Christian history. And that's where we get this World War I, World War II, Zionism, Palestinian concept. Because when Zionism decided that because of the political persecutions that Christian leaders inflicted upon the Jews and their history, that a false narrative would be created around the oppression of Jews by Muslims. And so round about that time between World War I, when you had the Balfour Declaration, you saw the weaponization of religion, right? So the Jews and the Christians had a very bad relationship. The Muslims, whenever the Christian Crusades came, there was significant persecution of Jews and Muslims. Like, read the real history, the violent history.
And even persecution against Christians themselves.
Exactly, yes. And, that divide and conquer and the weaponization of the religion in order to conquer land and engage in crusades. And this weaponization of religion is where people confuse the religion with the weaponization of the religion. And that always happens at the state level. That always happens at the covert war level. And so if you look at this false dichotomy, what came from Zionism? Well, it was a bunch of ethnic Jews that didn't really practice Judaism, that provided a financing with the bankruptcy of the UK government that was at the end of the Bank of England's debt cycle, that also had the Ottoman debt that was causing the fall of the Ottoman Empire, at the same time as destabilizing Russia and putting in the Soviet Union, and creating the Federal Reserve in 1913 before World War One. Then you had 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution to take over the oil resources in Russia. Then you had the destabilization of the Middle East. I around the time we were in an industrial revolution, what was the commonality? They needed oil. The empire needed oil. The British was handing over to the Americans. The Federal Reserve was the fake capitalism. The Zionists provided funding to the British government. The Walt Rothschild was declared a Jewish state in occupied, Palestine. That was at the same time as they declared it to the Russians and the French. They declared it to the Russians, the French, and the Zionists. So what happened? This is round about the time when you got the new interpretations of Christian literature, which was, prior to that, you had the King James Bible, and then you had the reinterpretations to weaponize Christianity. And remember, the Christian Crusades was always, how do you recruit an army? Even the forming of America. The forming of America was a genocide of up to 100 million people through settler colonialism, based upon religious persecution in Europe and recruiting an army to commit terrorism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of a native population in order to create what later became settlers, and then the Europeans started fighting each other. Then you had a Declaration of Independence at the exact time that the Wealth of Nations was written. So you had the Wealth of Nations, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, religious persecution, ethnic cleansing, genocide, the overthrow of empires, and then that war set up the Bretton Woods order that we have today. What is the commonality in all of that? All of those is very, very interesting. But it was the weaponization of Christianity to justify war and conquest of land and resources by combining religion and state. Then a breakaway movement, that then led to the divide and conquer, sectarianism, and breaking up, and then you have that. Then you have the weaponization of Judaism in order to take the actions of Christian leaders and the persecution of the Jews. And remember that this is a very interesting part of it. So in Islam, we stayed to root to the problems with riba and debt, but the empire fell when they submitted to empire, to riba and debt, because the Ottomans were debt free. But the Christians stayed that usury is prohibited, so they used the Jews in order to do usury. Now, the Jewish literature said that the Jews can't lend to each other, but outside of our tribe, we can engage in usury. Where were those scriptures? Those scriptures were, if you look at, and this isn't me speaking as a Muslim, this was me speaking as somebody that was looking at the preservation of the Quran relative to the 1,000-year history of the Bible, relative to the even older Torah, which, by the way, as a Muslim, if we had a preserved Torah and Bible, we believe in Prophet Musa, we believe in Moses, we believe in Isa and Jesus, and that they were there to create those divine, preserve those divine literatures, but they weren't preserved, and we'd have to follow them, and we believe it would be consistent with the Quran if we had the preserved version. But anyway, those versions of changing literature in order to achieve political manipulation to wage war so that financiers could benefit in the conquest of resources and land is the entire history of the weaponization of religion. So the Christian leaders got the Jews to create the banking system. The banking system and the financial industrial complex came from that root of wealthy families. And then they became a wealthy, tribe, as it were. I'm trying not to be stereotypical, and I believe that Judaism is a religion, not an ethnicity. In the Quran we have a tribe of people that descended from the prophets of Yaqub and Israel, and they were, for that time, that was a tribe, and there's a story we have around what happened with that tribe, and then we have a religion. And I don't believe this weaponization of the combination of ethnicity and religion was a weapon that ended up recruiting a terrorist group called Haganah and Lagan that then became the IDF once they managed to turn Israel into a state in 1948. Now, what did they do with that state? Well, they took the trauma of the Jews and the Christian persecution and the trauma of World War II and what the West did to itself, and then weaponized that in order to say, come to Israel, join the army, and they basically covertly created the whole terrorism industry. And then what did they do? They weaponized the historical tensions between Christians and Muslims, and they started funding groups covertly. When they created wars, that led to Muslims that were financially persecuted. They may not have studied their religion from first principles. And so that put them in certain cults that could then be weaponized. And to say, don't read the Quran, this is what the Quran says. Then you have covert infiltration of various sects within Islam. And you have the covert funding of those sects so that you can create divide and conquer operations that then leads to the conquest, sectarianism, divide and conquer, and then that later then led to covert operations. For example, if you've heard of Safari Club was created by George Bush, and it was a network of intelligence agencies that recruited Osama bin Laden as a CIA asset. And then later we obviously had 9/11, and there was an investigation. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories, but if you read the investigations into the intelligence funding operations, you get back to connections to Mossad, connections to CIA, and connection to Saudi intelligence through financing mechanisms. So all this to say is that the religion is weaponized, and that's the version you're downloaded. Now, that's the version that you then realize, okay, weaponized Judaism, weaponized Christianity, weaponized Islam. But where did the terrorism narrative came from? It came from the Zionists. That was the birth of the terrorist industry. And if you read declassified documents, read it. I'm not talking any conspiracy theory. Everything I'm talking about can go back to a declassified document. There was a book called a declassified document called Operation Gladio. And what it was during the Cold War, they left stay-at-home armies that they would call communists. They would call them communists, and they would engage in terrorism in order to gain refinancing contracts across Europe. And so they would take the Cold War to acquire resources, finance the governments, but they would pay for these terrorists. And so if you look at the history of terrorism, it came from the Zionists. Operation Gladio revealed that it was done by CIA, MI6 during the Cold War. And then it was manufactured after 9/11 as a weapon to create the fake war on terror narrative that then led to the taking, the operations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Sudan, in Somalia, now Iran, take your pick. And what were those countries? Those were countries that weren't members of the Bank for International Settlements or have a Western central bank. So there's a correlation between war, your resources, not having a central bank, and then you realize these are financial manipulations of the people. So your job as a person is to guard your mind. And that's when we need, a spirit, an ethical code, guarding our mind, a commitment to knowledge, and a greater accountability. Because if your ultimate judgment is that you have to tell the truth, even when it's against your interest, and you might get things wrong, you can, or you might be having to engage in a defensive environment, which is explained to us. We know how to deal with these things, but the inner accountability is you, and you have to be truthful. And it just so happens that the ethical industries that we're prohibited from engaging in are the very activities that are the most profitable in the West: gambling, drugs, alcohol, banking, usury. And we're prohibited from that. So you understand why, when you combine Christianity with conquest, Islam with conquest, and Judaism with conquest, you get a massive psyop where religion is weaponized. But this is where this history between, Islam and Christianity comes from.
This is super interesting, and I'm always in awe of the level of detail you're able to go into on these matters, and so many questions come to mind as well that I think that will be on the forefronts of the minds of Muslims when they hear about these things, right? And the first one that I think of is, I think I 100% agree, that yes, free trade, hard money, and then that the voluntary participation part is, I guess, in my opinion, a bit of a libertarian pipe dream. If you if you believe that humans without any spiritual guidance, acting purely in self-interest, will produce good outcomes for society, there needs to be some accountability there to a higher power. There has to be accountability to a higher power. And this is where free trade and hard money actually flourished for centuries during Islamic expansion across the continents. And that's what we saw. And I think a number of the things that you mentioned as well is really should be of particular concern to Muslims, because when we talk about these events over history, we have been at the receiving end of much of it, I think is safe to say, especially with the wars after 9/11, $8 trillion, I think, printed and paid for funding those wars in Muslim countries. The grab for natural resources has largely occurred in Muslim countries. The toppling of leadership, the propping up of extremism and CIA assets in these regions, it's been Muslim countries that have suffered, and Muslims that have suffered a huge deal as a result of these bigger games that are being played on the world stage. And it does seem like money and the monetary system plays a huge part in it, as it becomes a tool that can be exploited by those bad actors, or anyone acting out of self-interest, perhaps without spiritual guidance, who ends up going down that endless pit of being controlled by their ego and their own nafs, will inevitably end up coming to. But money seems to be a hugely important factor here. And I guess the question is, does Bitcoin give us a chance as Muslims to reclaim a golden age that we once had for centuries? And what is to stop us ending up how do we stop ourselves going the same route that the Ottomans did, when they I guess embraced riba after a point of time, and it really caused them to fall apart.
Yes, and this gets into a very philosophical question, but the end result of libertarianism and self-interest maximization without a clear guidance of ethical accountability is might is right. And so might is right is what ends the gold standard, and you end up with a fiat currency and a central bank. So there's a cyclical nature in there. So then you end up with, well, what can you do? Well, we know from our scholars that debasement is a problem, hard money, and then you end up with, well, what is hard money? Okay, so hard money, if we look at the entire history of money, is based upon what's called a stock to flow. So Seyfedin Ammous wrote an Austrian book called The Bitcoin Standard. And anyone who wants to understand Bitcoin, I recommend it from an Austrian perspective. And then as a Muslim perspective, I think, the Muslim Bitcoiner just did a book, which has been on my list. I haven't got to reading it yet. I'm very excited about reading it. And the reason I'm very excited about these things is because I'm drafting a new book at the moment as well on this understanding. But you end up with stock to flow. What stock to flow is what is the supply and what does that mean relative to the demand? So if you look at the entire history of gold with 5,000 years, it's grown at an average of 2% per year. And that has meant it's hard money where nothing else has been hard money. Those that followed a silver standard, it got weaponized. The stock to flow is not as good. It started to get industrial applications because you now need silver for building, electric vehicles and semiconductor chips and AI and robotics and all that stuff. And so hard money has utility, but it also has the right stock to flow, which means that it can't be printed. It can't be created through innovation. It has to have an amount of the money circulating stock, and it has to have a clear flow that can't lead to mass debasement. So the hardest form of traditional commodity money, when you look across, the worst is fiat currencies. A government can just print it, or a bank can issue it based upon anyone wanting to take out a mortgage. So that's the softest form of money. But the hardest form of money ended up as gold, and that has stood the test of time for 5,000 years. Now, a hard form of money did come along in 2008. And we could go into that origin story but it's only got 17 years of history. And so I think it's a bit, we're in the midst of a technical war right now in the Bitcoin space. And we've got probably 2 more to go. We had one in 2017. We just resolved one this year. And there are 2 big questions around quantum computing and privacy to be resolved. And so kind of then I think we're done at that stage. But that 17-year experiment was to create money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply. And the most important thing is that you can own it without a bank. You can spend it in an innocent until proven guilty system without a government. So I can transact with anyone. I still got to be ethical or legal or whatever your code is. Otherwise it could be, but you can spend it without permission. And finally, it's got a fixed supply. And the hard supply was based around a harder form of money. And there's currently 20 million Bitcoin with another million left to mine, roughly. They will all be mined by 2140. And the miners, they provide security and create a decentralized central bank, let's call it. Now, so we have gold with 5,000 years. We have an Islamic principle that there's free will and money is neutral, but there's a problem when it's not hard. It leads to the cyclical rise and fall. If you can keep it hard and you can keep people ethical, then I believe we can have an economy that doesn't have to go through these cycles, but the human nature will drive people away from their ethics and away from hard money by debasing it with a fiat currency. So what can you do with that? Well, you can exit with that. So you can say, I can't control the world, but I can control me. And so now that can either be me as a self-interest, profit maximizing, utility maximizing individual, or it can be an accountable me, accountable to a creator, a community, a god, a country. But I think the higher you get to the creator, for the reasons that I've already stated, the more you're going to be in line with truth. The further you are in terms of accountability, the further you are going to be away from truth, because it would be ultimately the ego and the self, as I said. But so we know that the entire history of humankind that we have documented is cyclical, with the rise and fall of empires. So what if you could just have your own hard money standard? Would that draw you closer or further away from something that might be more sustainable? I think closer. And so gold ended up with, if you store it and you use it as your money, then you've got a little sustainable economy in yourself. And then if you spend that in your community, you end up with the limitations of gold. You realize that it's hard to audit. It can be counterfeited. It can't travel across borders or travel across the world very easily without owning vast amounts of shipping and insurance infrastructure. And then you end up centralizing it. So you put it at a central bank, and those that are closer to the money printer end up with all the gold. The same thing is happening to Bitcoin right now. The closer to the money printer, there's a company called Strategy, headed up by Michael Saylor. He's creating digital credit where he's centralizing the Bitcoin, issuing paper securities, and BlackRock and other companies are doing the same, so that they can end up with the Bitcoin and you end up with a token, and centralizing it. Okay, so what can you do? Well, you can stop the centralizing forces. So what did Bitcoin do that gold couldn't? Well, it gave you a way of storing value at scale. So storing storing $1 worth of Bitcoin is the same as storing $1 billion of Bitcoin in terms of what you need to do to secure $1 and what you need to do to secure $1 billion. The same process of sending $1 of Bitcoin is the same process as sending $1 billion of Bitcoin. And also, the money supply, the units of Bitcoin will never change, ever. And that's enforced by maths and code as long as we can remain decentralized. Okay? And so all of that gives you the ability to take the store of value properties of gold and the median of exchange properties of fiat currency, and potentially get to the point where you price things in Bitcoin as a unit of account. That's the journey, right? So we've taken the best of what corrupted cash, fiat currency is the corrupted version, and created a median of exchange where you can spend your Bitcoin. And we took the best properties of gold. Now the question is, can Bitcoin remain decentralized? And
that's what I want to ask you about is, do you think the drive to centralization in case of gold and in case of Bitcoin is due to the belief in centralism or in statism, or is it is the belief in state and statism ideology the cause for the centralization of gold, and or is it the nature of gold that led to this centralization?
Yeah, that is my question. That is the question, brother. So if we look at Bitcoin's history, These are my personal beliefs, and I can't prove them, but I've studied this extensively, and I couldn't give you conclusive proof. But this is the belief that I've come up with, having been involved with so many from so early. Prior to Bitcoin, there was something called DigiCash, and there was a bunch of other Bitcoins. All of them were trying to create digital fiat currency with privacy, and it was created by cypherpunks that believed in private money. And all of them were shut down or failed because there was a centralizing force. And so DigiCash failed because it relied upon a company, which they could shut down, and it relied upon having a bank account that they could then turn into private money, which the banks could just shut down. That was the last iteration before Bitcoin. And it was created by a guy called David Chom, who's like the father of many of the innovations behind Bitcoin. And David Chom taught cryptography and various things at a university in Denmark and in Amsterdam, I believe. And one of his students was a guy called Len Sassaman, who had all the skills to build Bitcoin, who was connected to a guy called Hal Finney, who was the first person to mine and receive a Bitcoin transaction from an anonymous person called Satoshi Nakamoto. My personal belief is that Len Sassaman may have been... So I think the DigiCash, when it was shut down, it became an intelligence asset. And that intelligence asset was meant to create a digital currency, which we're now having law for right now in America through the Genius Act and Clarity Act. And it was meant to be done through stable coins and central bank digital currency, privately issued digital programmable fiat currency, or central bank issued digital programmable currency. I think that project still continues today, and I think it was an intelligence project. Now, in 2008, after Larry Fink created the mortgage-backed security, blew up the financial system, and got a contract with the Federal Reserve to acquire companies and fix the global financial crisis, and end up buying much of the assets of the City of London, like Barclays stockbrokers, there was a breakaway project called a white paper, the Bitcoin white paper, in 2008. And it was released anonymously by somebody that needed to be incredibly talented to hide their identity, which is a skill that very few people in the world would have. That person released a white paper on how to have a decentralized structure that had no company, no dependence upon a bank, and had many of the properties that would allow for what Bitcoin created. It relied upon a decentralized network of miners, a decentralized network of nodes running the software, enforcing the rules, miners creating blocks, and an open source development project where everyone could audit it in the open. That was what was designed, and it created this concept called proof of work. And my personal belief is that Len Sassaman was the most likely person that released that white paper as a breakaway project, knowing that a digital control grid was being created that later became a stable coin and central bank digital currency. Now, what's interesting is Hal Finney, the second person that received the first Bitcoin transaction and mined with Satoshi, wrote a post on a Bitcoin forum talking about how Bitcoin could become a collateral network for a bunch of fiat, digital currencies. And so Hal Finney knew what they're trying to create today is. Len Sassaman created a breakaway project. Hal Finney started mining it and gave a Bitcoin talk forum on how you use Bitcoin as collateral and what later became stable coins and central bank digital currencies through private currencies and various other things. So the two projects remained. One is now CBDCs and stable coins, and the other is Bitcoin. Interestingly, Satoshi, when WikiLeaks, who was exposing the Iraq war, Julian Assange was exposing the crimes against humanity, that a million civilians and children and what else have been killed in the Iraq war. He created a website called WikiLeaks that got financially blockaded. And he said that he would like to use Bitcoin to get around the financial blockade. And Satoshi says, we're not ready for this type of attention. And immediately at the same time, Julian Assange agreed to delay it. Then we had some improvement proposals come through. Then Julian Assange used it on WikiLeaks to take contributions. And the only reason we found out about the crimes against humanity and the crimes that were committed in Iraq and many of these wars in the Middle East was because there was a whistleblower in the intelligence apparatus that was leaking them to WikiLeaks, and Bitcoin allowed it to not get financially blockaded. And then they obviously took out Julian Assange, and Keir Starmer tried to put allegations on him and things like that happened later. But you got these merging stories that kind of... Now, the developer that Satoshi handed over to was a guy called Gavin Andreessen. Gavin Andreessen announced in 2011 that he'd been contacted by the CIA, actually the VC arm called InQtel, where the CIA funds startups. And Gavin Andreessen, at the same time as WikiLeaks accepting Bitcoin payments and revealing the military crimes, beating the financial complex through a financial blockade, he went to meet the CIA. He later stopped receiving his commit access because he endorsed a guy called Dr. Craig Wright that he said was Satoshi. But anyway, get back. 1 month after that meeting, Len Sassaman, we were told, committed suicide. And later, Hal Finney died. And so I don't believe anyone has access to those keys. But the origin story of Bitcoin, I believe, was a breakaway project from central bank digital currencies and stablecoins. And what they're doing now, today, is trying to centralize as much Bitcoin so they can use it as collateral for CBDCs and stablecoins. So they're taking the same playbook as what they did with gold, and they're trying to do it with Bitcoin. And they're pretending that they're on our side. And what is the mechanism that they're using? Convenience. And so if you can hack people's cold wallets, and you can hack services that use Lightning Network, and you can hack BTC Pay server that's helping people take payments in a decentralized way, and you can co-opt the largest stablecoin provider by hacking 119,000 Bitcoin from Bitfinex and Tether, which was co-created by Brock Pierce, who was in the Epstein files trying to infiltrate the Bitcoin developers, then you can go through this whole story and realize the game here. So in answer to your question, and sorry it's a very long question, the origin story, I believe, of Bitcoin was a resistance against what they want to do today. And they tried to co-opt it in every way possible, and they failed. They tried to divide and conquer it. They did controlled demolitions. They installed people. They tried to take over developer communities. They funded both sides. They did Operation Gladio. They did everything that they possibly could. And Bitcoin still has a network of nodes, miners, and developers that are still open source. And so as long as we can maintain that, and there's no guarantee we can maintain it, how do we know if we've lost? Once, what did the US government say they were going to do? They said, we're going to confiscate Bitcoins and put them in a Bitcoin strategic reserve with Coinbase. What did BlackRock do? BlackRock said, after Operation Choke Point 2.0 that wiped out a bunch of fraudulent crypto companies and banks, suddenly Wall Street came back with an easy solution called a Bitcoin ETF, and you can put it in your pension. But we're going to hold the coins with Coinbase. And then a guy came out of nowhere called Michael Saylor, saying that all companies and public companies should put their Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and now has 840,000 Bitcoin, while he has a government service called Strategy Government Services with board. One of the main board member was a lady that has worked for covert operations of the CIA for 26 years, of providing intelligence services to the government while putting those Bitcoin not in self-custody, but in Coinbase and Fidelity, the same Fidelity that created a custody service in 2014, one of the biggest asset managers in the world, when all of the infiltration attempts started in 2014. So can it resist it? That is the question. Gold in self-custody resisted it, but most of the gold ended up in custody. Bitcoin in self-custody resists it. Right now, 70% of the Bitcoin is outside of the financial industrial complex and the custodians. If they take all the Bitcoin and everyone gives their Bitcoin, then they won. Because then they can control the miners through public companies, and they can make nodes no resistance because they custodied it all. And then they can co-opt the developers. That's the battle.
And I think this is like a really good reminder, and a really serious reminder to people, like following on from that question I had asked you previously about how do we, we have the tools available to us to almost bring back a golden age for our ummah again, as we had in centuries prior, because the tools are available and we have what tends to be missing, which is genuine accountability. And I asked you, how do we avoid falling for the same traps that cause that to unravel? And you mentioned the importance of self-custody there, and that having self-custody and building in a sovereign way for, starting for yourself, but then your family, your community, the supply chains for your community, actually building in a sovereign way on sovereign money in self-custody allows you to, even if things do start to centralize outside of your family, outside of your community, you can still operate on sovereign rails. I think this again stresses the importance of self-custody, of remaining sovereign, and not falling for the conveniences and the scaremongering that is clearly taking place to try and centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. How do we? A lot of Muslims will hear this and they will think, my suspicions are confirmed. The CIA was behind it. It's being centralized. All of my FUD is true, right? What would you say to the Muslims who are perhaps pessimistic for these reasons? Are there any? Is it that it's in their control? Is there something they can do, or do they just have to hope for the best?
No. So we live in the AI world today. I don't know how to say this. If you're not technically literate, then you need a family that is technically literate. There's no other choice. You either become technically literate today, or you outsource that to your close proximity because you're not in a place to be able to do that. But the world's not going to change. Like we are moving to a hyper technocratic society world. This is the biggest change of our lifetime. There's no doubt about it. You've got the fall of an empire, like the American empire is at the Ibn Khaldun end of empire stage. Sheer extraction, sheer asset stripping, sheer wealth inequality, sheer degeneracy, sheer extraction. That's where we are in the West. That's not going to change. We have governments that are fully captured by banks and financial institutions. The governments aren't in charge. They're bought. If you think this is about building a smaller government, you don't know who's in charge. Your leaders aren't in charge. Just look at the UK. We've had 7 regime changes in 10 years. Each one of them was associated with a corrupt mission, whether it be selling more vaccines, whether it be having lockdowns, whether it be, connections to taking out Julian Assange, whether it be sending billions of taxpayers' money and money printed to corrupt officials in Ukraine to spend on military companies like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic, Raytheon. We're not defending democracy. The democracy has been bought. Okay? Don't listen to the politicians. They are captured, all of them, by design. You can't become a politician unless you are compromised. And even if you start that way, you will be, to succeed, you will be pushed. That's how the system has systemically been designed. So what can you do? Well, you can engage in politics at the local level. You can spend your money and decide where you spend your money. You can invest in things that are community driven. If you've got wealth, you can set up waqfs, endowments that contribute assets to cash flows that support causes that are protected structurally. You can continue to contribute, as we have to. And so what you do with your money is really the most important thing here. Now, if Bitcoin was created by the CIA and not a breakaway movement from a central intelligence project, then there's no way it would have been designed. So what you need to do is you need to take your AI and you need to ask it to read the Bitcoin white paper, and you need to ask it the most basic of questions of how Bitcoin was designed to be decentralized. And then you need to take that AI and ideally later, either you, your family, or you set up your own local environment for your own LLMs, and you don't subscribe to the centralized AI eventually. I'm not saying you do it. Look, it's a journey. Don't, calm down. We can only do better or worse, right? Sometimes we have to make very bad decisions in imperfect environments. Are we making better decisions or worse decisions, right? Okay. There's no opt-out of this. The only way to opt out is if you're off the grid. Like, this technocracy is where we're going. And you will be eaten alive if you're not have a family that's at least someone's technically literate to protect your family. You will. Sorry, hackers are coming. This is all coming. And an empire's changing. And when an empire changes, things get craziest. And China's a rising empire, which is a technocratic country by design. Okay? So this is happening. And you then take your AI and you ask it to audit the code. And you ask it the most basic of questions. And then you continue on this journey. Now, you can either take it from me, which in Bitcoin we have a mantra called don't trust, verify. And before you couldn't verify, you probably couldn't read the code. I couldn't read the code. But now we've got the ability to take the weapons of centralization, AI, and create decentralized environments on our own computers and use it to resist. This is digital resistance against centralizing forces. So Bitcoin has pockets of capture: developers, miners, nodes. Those are the three parts. And our job is to keep them as decentralized as possible and make sure that we engage in civil wars to make sure not one of those is in charge. In 2017, we had a civil war where miners and companies wanted to take over Bitcoin and change the code, and they lost because the nodes and users said, you can't change the code. In 2026, the developers started changing the code and policy overtly rather than covertly because not enough people were paying attention. So originally we had something called SegWit. Then we had Taproot, which hardly anyone was debating. Then we had a policy change that meant you could put more data on the blockchain. I don't want you to, you can ask your AI to explain this as if you were 3 years old, okay? These things happened. We just had a battle where the nodes tried to change the code because they didn't like what the developers did. And the miners said no. I was on the side of nodes both in 2017 and 2026. I won in 2017, I lost in 2026. What I wanted, I couldn't get. That's the point. We got a few more of those battles, one around privacy and another around quantum resistant addresses. We know how to solve those problems. We have people that have different ideas, and we have bad actors that want to infiltrate us. That's why the CIA does these operations, because they don't control Bitcoin. If they control Bitcoin, they just knock on the door of Tether like they did and said, can you please confiscate Iran's money? But you know what? Iran said, you can take my stable coins, but I still got my Bitcoin. Because Iran was mining their own Bitcoin and holding it in self-custody. And then they're allowed to store it and spend it. Now, you can have all the opinions on Iran. This is not a political anything. This is a statement of fact. UAE is mining its own Bitcoin. El Salvador is buying one Bitcoin every single day and publishing it on a wallet address. What did Norway do? Norway bought MicroStrategy shares and a Bitcoin ETF, which centralizes to Coinbase in the end. That's the custodian of all of that. Even the Kingdom of Bhutan, they created a Bitcoin mining hydro operation that made them the largest per capita sovereign country Bitcoin holder in the world. What did they do? They put a bunch of it on Celsius and managed to pull it out before the bankruptcy. But so it is how you store it. So here's the answer to the question. If the CIA created it, why is the CIA engaging in so many operations, and Mossad and MI6, to take us out? And I've done nothing from the inside but study every single operation and been involved in every single one of them as a shareholder over 100 different companies that got invited to meet some of the early Bitcoin developers right at the beginning, and documented the whole journey on YouTube for 15 years now. And I've made every mistake under the sun, and I fell for every operation that was available. But at the end of it, I can see that there has been significant operations to try and control those 21 million Bitcoin. And as long as they don't get them, then we have decentralization with pockets of centralization that we need to resist against at all cost, because that's the real battle. And so as a Muslim, you get to own your own money that boycotts the system, the central banking system. You get to spend your own money without the permission of a bank. That meant that no riba and interest needed to be created for you to spend your own money. And you get hard money in a free trade environment, but the ethics aren't codified into Bitcoin. Bitcoin can be used by anybody, so it's Austrian by nature. And so what can you do? Well, you can use it in line with your truth and your ethics. And we can build communities on that. And if we want, we can build countries that use Bitcoin as collateral in an actual Islamic compliant financial system where fiat currencies are created not with interest, but with collateral, in order to build an alternative monetary system for your country. Lebanon tried to do that, and the IMF took them out. El Salvador tried to do that, and the IMF took them out. In fact, Lebanon used the IDF and Israel in order to destroy the banks that were allowing people to take their gold and borrow against it in an interest-free Islamic loan. They took the collateral and they blew up the buildings. They did the same in Gaza.
These were the Qadr Hassan banks, weren't they?
Absolutely. When the corruption, the Lebanese government that relies upon USAID and IMF subsidies in order to control the army, ended up with a central bank that shut everybody out of their bank accounts. And then the IMF blew up the system with excess debt. Then they physically blew up the system, and they had natural disasters. And now the the resistance created a financial system where 3 million Lebanese people could take their jewelry and their gold and get an interest-free Islamic loan against it. As long as the base of the collateral is hard and it can be used to create a free trade fiat currency median of exchange with some kind of governance network, or even just a decentralized, and the Ummah is a decentralized network of us holding ourselves accountable to our creator, then we have the tools. And the only thing that stops it is us getting corrupted. And they will corrupt us. And countries are corruptible. And so at the base layer, you can exit completely, and you can spend your Bitcoin for whatever cause you want, and you can invest it however you want, and you can save it outside and boycott the system. So the onus is on you. In the fiat currency world, you're trying to cleanse a corrupt system in a debt-based Ponzi scheme. Now, the ratio at which you have to participate there and stay in here depends upon your wealth growing. And me personally, as a Muslim, we believe that if we do good with our money and circulate our money, then we get 10 times the reward. And if we do bad for it, it's you get one score, one bad point. But if you do good with it, and not good for show, not good to tell people, good for Allah, then we get 10 times the reward. So we have the tools we need, and it's decentralized. And guess what the battle is? The battle is not Iran against Israel. The battle is not the British Empire against the European Empire and the American Empire. The battle is not BRICS versus the financial industrial complex. The battle is the global control grid of centralizing technology that we win by creating a decentralized community of decentralized technology, decentralized identities, and don't fall for the psyops. Bitcoin was created in a way that nobody has been able to replicate, ever. Silicon Valley created 1 million foundations with 1 million alternative coins. I would normally say another word, but for respect, I don't want to say SHIT coins. 1 million versions of Silicon Valley psyops to confuse you. They even put an Islamic riba compliant label on top of it. These are centralized, bad stock to flows created by people that may be well-intended, but where they can be, it's not neutral. And remember what we learned from our scholars. Ibn Khaldun, Al-Ghazali, money is neutral. Money has to be hard. Free trade has to happen, but it's the corrupting forces that kill them every time. Alternative coins, stable coins, central bank digital currencies, Ethereum, XRP, Sharia compliant, whatever label they put on it. Remember, when you put humans in the equation, sadly, the label, the certifier, becomes the corruptible element that can be turned, no matter how bad or well-intended they may be. That's what the intelligence apparatus do. So that's what Bitcoin solves. I don't think it fixes the world, but it can bring you closer to your ummah and your ultimate judgment.
And this is super important to say, is that it can be quite easy to say, fix the money, fix the world. It's a nice slogan, but we know Bitcoin is merely a tool and part of a wider tool set of decentralized technology that we have to harness if we want to actually break free and be sovereign. And even then, it is not going to be easy. Like you said, there is a centralizing force of this kind of technocratic regime that will try and stop it and is relentlessly trying to stop it. And we have to adopt decentralized technologies and become technically literate, or at least enough of us have to be that communities can build around that. And we have to adopt those technologies and maintain that decentralization and avoid falling for everything else that is going on. And this is actually one of the big themes that the Bitcoin Majlis and the Muslim Bitcoin Summit is trying to get people on board with, is this idea of what we coin a digital hijra. This is a digital hijra. It's a struggle. A hijra for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions was not easy. It was difficult, and that is the same applies today. If you want to adopt these technologies now, it's not necessary. It is less convenient to use Bitcoin as money right now than it is to use fiat currency as money, and it is less convenient to adopt some of these decentralized technologies that are open source than it is to use the centralized ones. That is the reality of it. But it's the struggle that we have to endure if we want to genuinely push back.
Mashallah, I agree. And as with all, this is, a neutral money that depends upon the person and how they use it. It is Austrian by nature. And so anyone can use that neutral, unethical or ethical is neutral. How you use it is either unethical or ethical. That doesn't change. But the neutrality is based upon its decentralized nature. And we talked about an invisible hand versus an open hand. Bitcoin is not God. Bitcoin is not Allah. This is not divine. This is an open hand. And sometimes around Bitcoin, there is a cult. There are people that worship Bitcoin like the last solution of the world, the last thing I can trust. There is a radicalized element to Bitcoin. So we have to remember our lessons here. Bitcoin is a tool, and Allah will take away that tool or give us that tool, but we engage in free will, and we engage in the battle, and that battle right now, from all my 26 years of trying to answer the question of what happened to my father's money, an open hand led me to this place to try and, inshallah, come up with the words to articulate and join a community of others that are trying to do the same. And I think that is a very niche, tiny community in the beginning. And this isn't a subject for everybody, but I believe it's an open hand, and I think it's a gift. And I think it's something we can harness, and I think it's something we can, everybody can utilize, and hopefully more people get to utilize, But that's the that's why I joined this. Bitcoin is a community in itself, a niche community. Self-custody is even more niche community. And then the Muslim application of that is a niche community and a niche community of a niche community.
Absolutely.
But so was the Quran, the preservation of the Quran. And think of, I don't want to be disrespectful here because I'm trying to choose my words carefully. But, there was a small group of people whose job with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that needed to preserve that Quran so that we could utilize the Quran as a technology for being spiritually the soul connecting to our Creator. It's a technology that was a gift that was preserved, and it's a miracle it was preserved. It was, and we get to utilize that tool. But the relationship is the soul and the Creator. And Bitcoin is a tool, a monetary tool, just like gold, that solves some very specific problems that were the limitations of gold. Now, 17 years, 5,000 years, incomparable in terms of risk profile. But it will be a small group of people that are fighting to preserve in that battle between decentralized and centralized. And now there is a reward for engaging in that battle, I believe. It just so happens that, in my opinion, I could be wrong, Allah knows best, but in my opinion, we're moving to a world where you either own a key, which is a technical term in cryptography, which is the baseline of the internet, or you give your key to someone else. A central bank digital currency, an AI from Anthropic or ChatGPT, all the centralizing services that prop up the military industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, and the technical industrial complex, they all own your key. A decentralized ID, a decentralized cloud storage network, a decentralized AI, this just means you need to hold the key. Now, the community that knows how to hold the key, that has been through the most amount of problems, is the longer you've been involved in Bitcoin, the more you would have struggled with that process of owning your own key and securing your own key. Now, beautifully, over the last 17 years, inshallah, an incredible amount of innovation around key storage has come out of it from this cryptography. Multi-signatures, multi-hardware wallet, two or three keys. You don't need to know what I'm saying right now. You will need to know what I'm saying about in the future. Because the same skill that allows you to own your own money is the same skill that allows you to not give everything away to the centralizing forces. So once you can hold your own money and secure it, you can hold your own data, your own identity, your own AI, your own LLM, your own environments, your own communities, and you can help others. So I do believe that a particular mission has been given to a niche community of people that are trying to preserve the decentralized nature of Bitcoin and fight for the ability to have enough people that hold their own keys. Because if enough people hold their own keys, Bitcoin remains decentralized. If everyone gives up their keys, Bitcoin loses. Allah knows best. There was a reason for that, and we move on to whatever the world gives us. But we have to engage in that fight. It's not divinely inevitable. Bitcoin's not God. There's flaws here, and we get to engage in that.
And that's just the benefit of being in a Muslim community that provides help to each other, and so one doesn't stay alone with these problems. And this is what we are trying to do in the next conference, inshallah, in London.
Inshallah. Yeah, this is it, and this is the mission. And I'm just conscious of your time, Simon. I know you've already given us so much of it, so thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. I did just want to ask you one last question, which is that given all of this and where we seem to be a huge shift happening, centralizing forces working against us at all times, and the various challenges that we inevitably face ahead of us, are you optimistic about what comes next?
As a Muslim, we have to be optimistic. It's part of our culture, but we have to be realistic. I believe that when I look at the big macro picture, let's take a step back. Using technology, our ability to become more knowledgeable has never been greater. The tools that are available to us. You can go through the Quran today and you can do your own exercise of looking at the translation of every single word using the tools, to verify for yourself, some of the work that the scholars did, decades, centuries ago without the tools. Now, we can use these tools. As I said, these tools can be neutral if we can keep them decentralized, or they can be a weapon. So my question to you is, my answer to that rather, is that the control grid is coming and the resistance is here. That's beautiful. So the world is changing. The empire is changing. I have no doubt that the American empire is now going to be a multipolar world. In a multipolar world, let's look around the world. The Middle East, which has been plagued by Sykes-Picot and the forever war model that plagued the American people. Here's the PSYOP. You paid for it. The Americans, the Europeans, the Brits, we get the debt. We get our share of the national debt. We paid for it. And the PSYOP was that we engaged in the mind control in order to divide and conquer and allow it to happen because we weren't smart enough to see through their psychological operations. or we didn't have the information. Today we have the information. Like if there's one thing we are in, is the information age. Now that is both a blessing and a curse, however we use it. This phone can be used as the worst surveillance tool to support unthinkable crimes against humanity, or it can be used to empower me with the tools that I need in order to make the difference that I want to make and communicate what I need to communicate in the world. So it's up to us. Like, I've never been more hopeful in our ability to have the tools to make the biggest impact possible. Now, realism. Realism is that most people are falling for psyops. I just think the vast majority of people are being radicalized into the worst version of themselves right now. I think the phone, we talked about that tool. If you're being told what you should consume, be very careful. Be very careful. Your social media is, the reason that birth rates are so bad right now is because of these, pushing you into this hypersexualized world and pornographic world and all the things we warned about. These are damaging to the family, to the unit, to you as a human. These are struggles. And more people have to go through these struggles than ever before, because this phone, if you're allowing it to control you, tell you what you should watch, it's going to be feeding you hateful content, the worst version of you, the nafs, the ego, the one that I'm right about everything. Look, people are being radicalized on a scale I've never seen before through these devices, through social media. And whatever worldview they're coming up with, they're being radicalized further and further and further and further, and it is reinforcing them. And guess what? As you post on these social media, remember what Elon said when he took over? He goes, you're getting freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Think about that as a psyop. Say whatever you want. Give me all the data. I want to know everything about you, what you eat, what you think, what you hate, what you love. And I'll give you reach if you say the right thing, if you post the right thing. The algorithm is saying, post the right thing and I'll give you more reach. So someone experimenting with this will say, hey, if I post this, I got hardly any views. If I post this, I got 1 million views and it went viral. Why don't I do more of that and more of that and more of that? Before you know it, you're not you. You are a conduit for the operating system that you allowed to take over your mind. And guess what? They're weaponizing it. They want people radicalized, because what's the solution? What was already built before 9/11? The Patriot Act, the war, the clean break memo. The wars that needed 9/11 were already determined. It was a leaked document. The Patriot Act, the legislation that allowed you to call people terrorists and circumvent the Constitution and torture people in Guantanamo Bay, was already written. They needed the false flag. They needed the operation so that you could be radicalized Americans into thinking that blowing up Iraq and committing crimes against humanity that were only exposed on WikiLeaks was a good thing. So this is the thing. This is the psyop. The standard God of your mind, the knowledge, the sovereign mind that you need to develop. You need to become a knowledge person. Now, the tools to achieve that have never been greater, but how people are using them, it scares me. It scares me a lot. Like, I can't go on social media or in a space and have a respectful conversation anymore. Like, I used to go up and I was part of like the Palestinian cause and various other things on there. You go on spaces right now, people think you're trying to, like, this isn't how we speak to each other. This is not respect. This is the worst of humanity that I've seen. If I pass a person in the street in a community, we're meant to have tolerance here. We're meant to, the tolerance online is radical. It's really radical. So this is a part of it, right? So a long answer to your question, because I've never given a short answer, and I don't know how to do that. If you want a short answer, don't invite me back. Is that we have to remain optimistic, because I'm very confident in our belief on what we are here on this earth to do, and our tools in order to do it have never been greater. But the number of the forces that we're fighting up against, I don't see us stopping the control grid at all. I do see us being able to free ourselves. And so what does that free ourselves mean? Do we become an Austrian libertarian, self-maximizing our own interest? Or do we use that to share, give more community, and get people, more and more people? That's the challenge. And I think the majority of people are being driven into, I don't trust anyone. I don't trust what I see. I don't even trust that we're on this podcast together, because it could be a deep fake and you could be trying to scam me to get to download software on my computer. That's a real challenge. Like we are about to enter into a world where you can't trust what you see. The fabric of society, the fabric of a functioning community is an element of trust, right? So what can you trust? You either trust the ego or you trust the creator. And, however you get there, that is like my confidence. And this is why I think we're on Earth. Our Earth is to pass that test. And we either pass or fail, and we meet our creator, and Allah knows best.
MashaAllah. This is amazing.
And that's why we will meet physically in London, not only online. So we be sure that we are not a deep fake.
Yeah.
It'll be, and this is, I think there's so much food for thought from this, and so much for people to really reflect on and think about. And I'm hoping real encouragement and reason for people to start taking this seriously, and start, coming to the summit. Start with coming to the summit. Start with, even if you're still skeptical and you still have doubts, and you're still, have your reasons for thinking that there isn't a solution, or that all hope is lost. Just come and, argue your point, ask your questions, come and have a look. We're going to be showing people how to harness some of this technology, not just Bitcoin, but the other technologies that come with that kind of this sovereign architecture and decentralized institution building. We can start it now, and that's the great thing.
And that is, by the way, that you brought up one more point I want to bring, because it's so important. The belief of no hope, of hopelessness, that's shaitan. That is when you believe that there is no hope. Think of your time preference. That's an Austrian concept as well, right? The ultimate time preference is believing there's an accountability in an afterlife, right? Beyond the life, and that we're accountable for what we do in this life. But what is the opposite of that? It's believing that there's no hope on this earth, that there's nothing. And what does that drive you to? The most short-term thinking you could ever imagine. When you believe that there's no hope, what do? You gamble. You're not accountable to a long-term future. You don't build a family. You don't do any of the things. And you end up, and guess what? They don't mind you being that person. They monetize it. They'll feed you content. They'll download the operating. They'll push you into pump and dump cryptocurrencies. They'll turn you into gambling. They want you to be in debt on credit card, believing there's no future. They want you borrowing against your entire future because you're consuming now, believing that you can consume now. This is all about taking that time frame and taking you to the most impulsive, the most short-term version of you, which is the most radicalized, and we as Muslims believe that is shaitan at work.
Exactly.
Wow, absolutely. That's a great message, a very important message to leave people with as well, I think. I think probably we've taken up quite a lot of your time. So, but again, I really appreciate you jumping on with us, and it's been great. It's been such a good conversation. Jazakallah khair. And really look forward to having you with us at the summit, and I'm sure there's much reason now for people to come and hear all the many other things I know you have to say as well. Even 2 hours is not enough time for the topics that there are to cover.
Yeah, well, it is a journey. Like, a journey starts, and hopefully, mashallah, like, this is. I know firsthand that what you think about Bitcoin is very different to the reality of someone that's been there from the beginning and understands it, and so you should try and learning how to secure your own key is the most important thing you could do. And Bitcoin is probably the best way to learn that. So if you just start with that, then maybe, that's a good reason to come and learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing.
Inshallah.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
It was
much,
really
Simon.
insightful and new perspective on Bitcoin from a
Thank you.
spiritual.
Thanks. And is there any way you want to point people to where they can find you online?
Yeah, I go live on YouTube and I publish all my interviews on YouTube, which is Simon Dixon 21 on YouTube. I have a decentralized community on simondixon.com in case any of these centralizing networks don't like my message. And I do post regularly on X at Simon Dixon Twit. And then at the same time, I'm also using some of the decentralized networks like Nostr as well and various other things. So again, don't get overwhelmed. This is a journey. You've got your whole life ahead of you. They want you to think the world's about to end and there's no hope. You got your whole life ahead of you. Put together a long-term plan. The ultimate long-term plan is the hereafter. But even then, you don't get overwhelmed. They want you really overwhelmed, thinking, I can't do this. Yes, you can. Each week, you just take a little chunk of it, say, right, I'm going to learn a little bit more, and do that each week. Just like even investments. The key to investing is they want you thinking you need to know how to trade. You need to know how the debt markets work, the commodity markets work, the currency markets work. Like the whole industry that I spent 26 years in, like, is the most confusing mismatch of jargon and complexity. It's really quite simple at the bottom, like free trade, hard money, and this complexity that they create around it is by design. And so the idea is we're in the information age. Each week you get a little bit better. And the key to investing is spend less than you earn, save the difference, and do that every month. And have a long-term horizon. And then what you do with that is what we believe. So again, don't get overwhelmed. There's a million things. I'm sharing 26 years of my thought experiment and experience here. But it's just small steps, better or worse, more haram, more halal, more subordinate, more sovereign. What do I need to learn? Am I moving into that knowledge? So keep going.
Amazing. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.